Okay, so I wanted to make a video on a chapter from Guide for the Perplexed. This is meant to be an addendum to chapter 2 of my video on Mishnah Torah, where I say that, where we're talking about the existence of angels. And I say in that video that when God is acting in the world, it's always through an angel. And that's not explicit in the chapter there. The chapter there really only says that angels exist and how they exist. So I wanted to read something in Guide for the Perplexed, which is explaining this idea that God is always acting through angels when he's acting in the world. So this is part 2, chapter 6 of Guide for the Perplexed. Maimonides begins saying that everybody knows that angels exist and that the term used for angels, which is generally Elohim, is kind of a homonym that it can be used in different contexts. It can be used for judges. I don't want to get into the weeds of this chapter, just kind of extract the relevant part to us. Of course, come back, read this chapter, understand it, but I try to keep things short. Here in the second section, Maimonides says that we know angels are incorporeal, and this agrees with the opinion of Aristotle, and there's only the difference in the names employed. He uses the term intelligences, and we say angels. So we see here, as is typical throughout Guide for the Perplexed, that he is employing Aristotelian paradigms regarding them as mostly true, and just disputing on some of the details. If you look up in Aristotle, which is a little bit above my pay grade, but if you look up in Aristotle about intermediary intelligences, that God is, as we described in the first chapter, as being unchanging, and that it's necessary to have intermediate beings. You can find this in Aristotle. I'm not going to go into it in depth, but I'll say that if you come to metaphysics, 1073a, this chapter will explain this idea of why it's necessary to have intermediary beings. People will say that Maimonides is kind of a lone voice in the Jewish world with some of these ideas, that he was very influenced by Aristotle, adopting a lot of his views, whereas most other rabbis did not. But a reason that I wanted to choose this chapter was that we can see here, and it's also typical other places, that Rambam will substantiate his views with sayings from Chazal, or sayings from the Talmud, or sayings in the Bible, indicating that is the Bible and the Talmud as well knew these ideas and endorsed them. And when it comes to truth, it doesn't matter who said it. It just matters what's true. So let's read this part inside. Yep. Here, Maimonides is talking about the meaning of angel, messenger, the different contexts it can be used in. I encourage you to see it for yourself. It's outside the scope of this video. Okay, so let's see inside from this section. When we assert that Scripture teaches that God rules the world through angels, we mean such angels as are identical with the intelligences that Aristotle talks about. In some passages, the plural is used of God, e.g., let us make man in our image. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language. Our sages explain this in the following manner. God, as it were, does nothing without contemplating the host above. I wonder at the Rambam says, I wonder at the expression contemplating, which is the very expression used by Plato. God, as Plato says in one of his dialogues, Timaeus, I believe it is, God, as it were, contemplates the world of ideas and thus produces the existing beings. So we see that an expression from the Talmud, this can be found in Sanhedrin 38b, that it says, the Holy One, blessed be He, does not act unless He consults with the entourage of above. So that he uses the same type of expression to describe God and his interaction with the language, with God, his interaction with the angels, with contemplating. And this is how Plato describes God interacting with the intelligences. In other passages, our sages express it more decidedly, saying God does nothing without consulting the host above. And I'll have to say I don't know what's different between this expression and the one above, but with this expression, Maimonides identifies the word familia, used in the original, is a Greek noun and signifies host. So this can also be seen here. I'm not sure if he's referencing another place, but it can be seen here. And in the Hebrew, we can see Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God does not Oseh Devar do anything, Ella, except In Kaim Nimlach, unless he is consulting the familia, with the host, Shalmaila, above. So this word, familia, is a Greek word. It's probably where the English word family comes from, I would assume. So it's interesting that these Greek expressions are being incorporated into the Talmud when we're talking about how God is interacting in the world. It indicates that in the Talmud, by the rabbis of the Talmud were familiar with Aristotelian philosophy as well and are endorsing it. It's probably not the case that, in Talmudic times, things were not, I imagine that these works were more scattered. They weren't codified the same way that for us and for Maimonides, Aristotle really served as kind of a clearinghouse for all these ideas and a point of reference. And we can refer to Aristotle directly and say this idea is found in the book of metaphysics, the book of physics, whereas for Chazal and earlier, the ideas were around, but they weren't organized the same way. So, it seems like Maimonides is pointing out that, not only that we have these conceptions about angels and how they're acting in the world, that they are always, that when God is acting in the world, that's always through angels, and that Chazal and in other places in Tanakh, in the Talmud, in the Bible, that this idea is being endorsed. In this section, he gives a few other examples, saying at the end, mentioning from Bereshit Rabbah, which is a midrash, that whenever the term Lord occurs in Scripture, the Lord and his court should be understood. So, yeah, that is, I think, sufficient proof for the idea of how Maimonides is holding with regarding angels, and this should aid our understanding of the second chapter of Yesodei Ha Torah.